Tonight, we are reminded that history is not only written in archives and official documents, but also carried in voices, memories, and lived experiences. From the quiet recollections of ordinary people to the transformative frameworks of scholarship, ideas travel, shaping how we understand ourselves and the world we inherit. In this moment, we are profoundly privileged to be guided by one of the most distinguished oral historians of our time, Professor Joanna Bornat. Professor Bornat's work invites us to listen, to hear the tremors of memory, the hesitations, the silences, and the insistence of voices that might otherwise be lost. She has shown us that oral history is not simply about collecting testimonies, but about opening spaces where individuals, especially those historically marginalized, can narrate their lives with dignity and depth. In doing so, she has illuminated how personal memory intersects with public history and how the everyday is inseparable from the grand narratives of society and culture. What sets Professor Bornat apart is her ability to weave together methodological rigor with ethical sensitivity. As co-founder and longtime editor of the journal Oral History, and through her pioneering works such as Oral History, Theory and Practice, and Reminiscence Reviewed, Perspectives, Evaluations, Achievements, she has expanded the very boundaries of what oral history can be, moving it from the margins to the very heart of historical inquiry. Her research into aging, migration, and memory demonstrates the power of oral history to connect generations, community, and geographies. By engaging with diverse voices, she reveals not just individual lives, but the structures of inequality, resilience, and belonging that shape them. This evening, as she speaks on the theme, we are all oral historians now. Professor Bornat challenges us to reflect on our own roles in preserving, interpreting, and respecting life experience. She asks us to confront questions that are okay,
Sorry.
that are as intimate as they are profound. What does it mean to remember? How do our stories change when told, retold, and reheard? And in an age of shifting identities, migrations, and digital transformations, how do we safeguard the fragile textures of human memory? Professor Bornat reminds us that history is not only written but spoken, heard, and shared. It is an act of connection between past and present, between the individual and the collective, between silence and voice. On behalf of Voices from the Periphery, it is with the deepest respect and gratitude that we welcome Professor Joanna Bornat. Her presence this evening transforms our gathering into a moment of reflection and inspiration, arguing us to listen more carefully, remember more generously, and imagine more compassionately the histories we inherit and the futures we hope to build. Up to you, ma'am.
Well, I'm expecting you to ask me questions rather than I give a presentation. So I'll start off by talking about what I mean by the title, which is "We Are All Oral Historians Now." That's because I'd rather this was a conversation than some kind of a lecture. So I hope we'll be able to have a question and answer session that you and I will be discussing. But to start with, the title, "We're All Oral Historians Now." This is a theme I've worked on, I've thought about for quite a while, when I began to realise that this must be about 20 years ago, maybe about 20 years ago, that when I talk to people, when I tell them that I'm an oral historian, I don't have to explain what it is. Everybody seems to know what it is, but I can remember a time when if I said I was an oral historian, I would have to then explain that it was. It's not something to do with some kind of, I'm not a dentist, I don't look into people's mouths. I'm not only a historian in a sort of traditional sense. I'm an oral historian, which involves talk, and in fact, importantly, it involves memory. So I've noticed that about 20 years ago, more and more people seem to know what that meant, to the extent now that everybody seems to know what oral history is. Everybody can talk about it to some level, to some extent, and it's part of almost everyday life. It's part of almost, one can see it, certainly here in the UK, you can see it used in advertising. You can see it used in projects at community level as well as at university level, and you can see it used in many different kinds of ways. Maybe not always in what I would call historical ways or historical contexts. So that's what I mean when I say we're all oral historians now. But that also, that statement carries with it certain, how can I put it, complexities. So if we're all oral historians, does that mean we're all doing the same thing? Does that mean we all have the same understanding and we're using what the founders of oral history, certainly in the UK, assumed it to be? But we're all exercising some kind of a critical view. For me, oral history is about a critical take on the past. It's about, as you were describing in your introduction, very much to do with giving voice to people who wouldn't normally be included in stories or accounts of the past. It's a challenge to the established understandings, and it's also a way of perhaps righting wrongs in that sense about what we understand history to be, what children learn history to be in schools. Oral history has played a part in that and continues to do so in a marginal way, but does it still have that critical relevance, that critical edge that I think some of us maybe 50 years ago were thinking about when we were talking about doing oral history? So it's to do with history, it's to do with a critical view, it's to do with memory, it's challenging what the sources are, that, as Paul Thompson in his book, which is the sort of, began it all, The Voice of the Past, when it came out in 1979, I think it was, he was challenging the assumption that oral history, to research the past, you need to have documents, and that it's only documents which enable you to flesh out accounts of the past. So that memory and spoken memory has as much an important role to play, and of course many of those documents themselves depended on memory. As one begins to delve deeper, you can see that aspect. So it's that critical edge, that inclusive nature, and it's that dependence, that celebration really of the spoken voice in telling the past. So that's what I understand oral history to be. That if it becomes something which everybody owns, which everybody uses in their own way, can we make sure that it still retains those characteristics? Is somebody going to respond to me?
Hello, ma'am? Yeah?
Yeah? Do you want to carry on a conversation then, or take up some of those points? How do you want it to proceed? I'm arguing that its success carries with it some danger, and that's the sort of point which I would hope you would want to take up with me, discuss with me, or what am I alluding to, or whether you would agree with that in the same way.
Okay, so am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah, yeah.
Am I
Are
audible?
you? What did you say? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, yes, very much.
Okay, okay, okay. So can I proceed to our question answer session with your permission?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, let's
Okay,
have a discussion. Let's
okay,
have a discussion.
okay,
I would like discussion.
okay. Shall we begin? Actually, I don't know. I mean, your audio is glitching. I don't know if this my problem or my connection problem, or I don't know really. Okay, so that's why sometimes the communication gap is happening. Okay,
Okay. So
so
did you hear you heard what I said?
yeah, man. I heard. Okay, so Professor, oral historians are not only collectors of stories, but also interpreters. How do you think one can balance that role, engaging critically with a narrative without imposing a framework on someone's memory?
Well, I think that's the central challenges in, and often people have. Um, I think it's partly wanting to celebrate, give voice to people, and wanting to enable people to, you know, put contribute their understanding of the past through memory. But there's always just that danger that in the interview situation, and then afterwards when you're working with a transcript, that you might then be imposing your own view, your own understanding, or using it in some way which is not, as one always can be sure of, the intention of the person who spoke, did the speaking. So I guess there are various ways in which that can, people can be protected. The interviewee can be protected, and that would be to make sure that they see what you produce, they see the transcript. If they don't like what's there, they can make changes to it. And I suppose also it's important to make sure that what you write and what you produce is in the public domain, so that it's not hidden away in some academic journal. It's not simply there to advance someone's career. That it's something there which is going to make a change in the public understanding of history as well. And my understanding in many ways is that many people, when they're interviewed, they're very keen, they're very glad to be interviewed because they want to feel that they're making a contribution to understanding the past. And certainly when Parvati Raghuram and Leroy Henry and I were interviewing South Asian geriatricians who are working as doctors in the UK, very much we understood that those mostly men, talking about their careers mid-20th century and after, they very much wanted to be recognised as successful professional doctors. They had encountered all sorts of kinds of racism in the context of working in the UK. They'd overcome all sorts of difficulties. They were working with perhaps the least attractive, if you want to put it, group of patients. They weren't working as surgeons, or they weren't working at the cutting edge of science and technology. They were working with older people, and so some of that kind of rubs off on them as professionals. But they were very keen that their interviews would contribute to understanding how people came to work in the UK health service from the subcontinent and what challenges they faced. This was a story they wanted to have told, and that's often been my experience interviewing people. That it's often very much a two-way process. Sometimes the person who's being interviewed has their agenda. They want to make sure that the world or the person they're talking to understands their perspective and that the interview has significance for them. And I think it's important for anyone who's doing the interviewing to have that understanding, that it's almost a transaction in a way. One ought not to feel one's extracting information from someone. And this was something happened to me very early on when I was doing interviews for my PhD. And my supervisor was Paul Thompson, and I went to interview textile workers. this is a long time ago now, and the beginning of a lot of oral history going on here in the UK. And you're taught how to behave in an interview, treat people with dignity, put them at ease. If possible, they choose where they're interviewed, usually in their own accommodation. And at the end of it, you thank them. And so I did all those things, and I thanked this woman who was in her 70s, 80s, probably my age now. And she said, no, she wanted to thank me. And that was quite a sort of a moment of illumination, that this wasn't just me getting their story, this was actually benefiting as they saw it, enjoying it, and feeling reports of transmitting that significance of the historical record. So that was salutary for me to understand. And so what you have to do, I think, is carry that realization through as you're working with someone, doing the interview, archiving it, perhaps using it in a publication, that it is a two-way thing. And so it's kind of partly it's internalizing that commitment, but it also, there are various administrative and administrative processes one can go through in order to protect people from being exploited, having their words taken away from them, used out of context. So I don't know if that's a long answer to your question, but hope it goes some way.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Okay. So, Professor, oral history is often described as one of the great success stories in modern scholarship. But I wonder, does that very success sometimes risk commodifying personal narratives, turning lived experiences into something consumable?
Sorry, I lost you there, but I've got your question written down. So you're asking me about the commodification of the interview, and does it risk turning it into consumable data? Yes, that's what you said. That's what I think you said, but I didn't hear you. And well, yeah, of course it does. Like any kind of historical data, it risks that. And I think what I've just been talking about, are there ways of protecting and making sure that people interests are preserved and not protected? I mean, there are different views. I would always give back the transcript to an interviewee to make sure that they're happy with what's there if they want to change it. And then after that, they have, they can be told, or they can understand what the uses might be, that it might go on the internet, and it might be used in different ways than they had previously understood. And now, of course, we're in the age of AI, and oral historians, certainly here in the UK, are very concerned about the way in which AI might be used to scrape through archives and dig up people's words, use them out of context. That's a very serious issue, which a lot of people are now investigating and finding out how we make sure, protect people from that. But in the end, I suppose there are limits to what one can do. You can say to people, yes, your interview is going to go onto into an archive online. And if they say no, then they can say no. They can actually close their interview for however many decades they want to. So there are various bureaucratic, administrative ways in which one can protect people from their words from becoming somehow, as you put it, commodified. And we have to be alert to that, because they're very powerful. The spoken word is very powerful, so there are ways in which it might be used out of context and in ways that the person initially hadn't thought about. Is that yeah? Yeah.
Ma'am, as I listened to you, I kept thinking about the relationship between interview.
You've frozen for me. I can't hear you now. It's frozen. I've lost you. I'm sorry. I didn't hear. Froze for me.
Hello, ma'am.
I didn't hear your question because.
Okay, ma'am. I'm asking again the question. As I listened to you, I kept thinking about the relationship between interviewer and interviewee. There are always subtle power dynamics at play. How do you think historians can address the ways these dynamics influence what gets remembered or what remains unsaid?
Well, it's more the sort of thing I've just been talking about. It's being aware of the range of emotions that might be generated, and people that here, or historians in various places are very becoming very concerned about the role of emotion in interviews and how on both sides affected. The interviewer might be quite upset to hear stories that are told. We've been recently looking at an article about women who this is a UK thing where maybe decades ago women who had children without being married would have the child taken away from them and brought up separately and might never see them again. And the telling of that story is very, very upsetting, and it can affect both the interviewer and the interviewee. And then, stories of violence experienced socially, racist attacks, things like that. I think you've got to understand the context in which people are telling stories, understand that historical context, because younger people might not understand the possibilities of, for example, a woman having a child taken away from her. So you have to put yourself in that historical moment. And I think there are many differences in the interview which are hard to, I think, get around. There are differences of gender, differences of race, differences of age. Interviewers are younger than the people they're interviewing, and most older people have their particular perspective on the world and the life they've lived through and times. So that there are those sort of differences. And people also are now, I think, becoming quite interested in interviewing children about their understandings of, and these might be children who've lived through troubled times, or it might be people remembering their childhood. So there are many different contexts and ways in which memory can be told, and that it's important to have some understanding of that context. I think what for me is the most sort of significant thing about oral history and what makes it so powerful, and this maybe sounds more academic than like in a public setting, is that it combines a sociological approach with a historical approach, so that you're talking to people, you're actually interviewing them, you're using if you might call it a sociological way of eliciting data, but at the same time you have to understand and be familiar with the historical context in which that life was lived. And you can't do that, and you can't really represent that story properly unless you tell that whole story. And it might mean you're actually aligning yourself in ways that are challenging. They should be challenging. I mean, we have a problem. We've had a problem, or we continue to have a problem in the UK, and I think it's a problem that is at the moment pretty major in the US, where there's attempts by the government to actually remove from public view views of the past which don't apparently fit with what is thought to be the American history. And we've had that problem here in the UK, where, for example, where in museums or in historical sites, where curators have been attempting to represent that history of that site or that place in a more complete way. For example, using the history of slavery to understand why this place is why the people who lived in this house, in this palace, were so wealthy. This is a challenge to the received understanding of the past, and a lot of people have begun to question, should we be doing this? This isn't the kind of history that people want to remember in Britain. But of course they're wrong. That is the kind of history we need to remember. We need to know where riches came from, how differences arose. So it's that whole historical context which I think is important if we're going to... I've almost lost track of the question. You asked me now... preserve the position of the interviewee, not to belittle, not to dismiss an account because it doesn't fit with the dominant story of the past. Is that an answer? I don't know whether that's an answer to your question now.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Another question that comes to my mind is about memory itself. Okay, ma'am?
Yeah.
So, since memory is always selective and constructed, how can oral historians navigate the tension between subjective recollections and the pursuit of historical truth without reducing the richness and complexity of those accounts?
Well, I think this is a double-edged thing, isn't it? It's something that's thrown at oral historians constantly because they're told that their data isn't reliable, their informants aren't reliable, memory is, in sense, as you say, unreliable. But it also it's a challenge then to oral historians. How do you come back at that? Well, one way obviously is to acquire as many accounts as possible, if it is possible, which might corroborate a story. Another is obviously you can find documentary sources which will support an account, and in The Voice of the Past, Paul Thompson illustrates that very well. And then the other approach, which Sandro Portelli and people like him and others, most of us, also adhere to, is not necessarily what is said, it's how it's said and in the context in which it's said. Why is it important that someone tells their story in that way, even if it's not absolutely 100% true? Why is it important? The telling has meaning in itself. So if somebody gives an account which isn't 100% accurate, may actually be wrong. And let's find out why. Where does that come from? How do they? Why is it important to them to tell that story in that way? And that meaning, as Portelli argues, is as important as any accuracy issue, because it stands as a witness to the, I suppose, the salience of well, no, not the salience. It stands as witness to the impact that context had for those people who lived through it. People understand it in different ways. And of course, people do misrepresent people in family history quite often. There will be conflicting views, and those conflicting views themselves are interesting. So I think we make something of it. We make something of those flaws. We make something of those misunderstandings. It's rich, this oral history. So let's not be put off by those critics who try to silence us by saying that can't be true or that's wrong, or
Ma'am, there's also a question of ethics. When oral histories are shared on public or academic platforms, issues of consent, ownership, and even re-traumatization come up. In your view, what is the most responsible way for historians to deal with those challenges?
It's a massive question, and it sometimes raises for me another distinction which I make, which I think it is important to be aware of. Well, we can actually, as I said before, we can provide documentation, we can enable people to understand what's going to happen, they can read about the research or the project which they're going to be involved in so that they've got an understanding of what's coming. But the problem is, once somebody starts talking, then they often say more than they expected, or they find themselves telling the story in a different way, and that might make them feel that they're somehow vulnerable. and of course, sometimes stories are searched for because of that kind of vulnerability. So we have to be alert all the time to those ethical issues. We have to make sure that whoever's being interviewed has, as far as they understand, given consent to what's happening. So there are those sort of administrative procedures that we have to go through. We have to be sure that if someone isn't, for various reasons may not be, may have some kind of cognitive vulnerability, then we have to make sure that they are protected in some way. And then, once the interview data is processed, is transcribed, and it's put in an archive or it's used, then obviously again, I think there are ethical issues there to make sure that people are represented in ways they want to be represented. They may seek to be anonymous. They may not want their words to be heard. As I said before, they could remain anonymous for how long if they want to be, or they may choose to speak. So there are kind of ethical ways and important ways in which we have to protect people from themselves. But I also have a kind of reservation about oral history being used in contexts where I think we're not talking about history, we're not talking about the past, we're not talking about memory. So there's a development mainly in the US now, or in the last 10 years or so, for what's called crisis oral history, where oral historians go into a situation. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, when New Orleans was completely flooded, oral historians were going to the rescue centres and interviewing people. That's not oral history for me. Those people are in a traumatised situation. We don't have the right under those conditions. We're not talking about the past, we're talking about the now. And I think we have to be very careful as oral historians that we don't use those situations where people may feel, they may let their guard down, that expression, let their guard down, and they may be keen to talk, but because they need to talk, and that's not about what's just happened to them. And I don't feel that that's history. So I have my doubts about what's called crisis oral history. I think oral history is about the past, it's about memory, it's not about what's happening to people now. So that's one way of, I think, taking an ethical stance and saying, stand back, recover in some way. This is not for us to actually get involved in as historians.
Okay. At the same time, I find myself curious about the silences and contradictions in testimony. We often celebrate rich narratives, but how should historians work with gaps, silences, or conflicting accounts, especially when they challenge established framework of history?
Well, what's in that question? Silences. Respect silences, don't we? If somebody doesn't, or leaves a gap, or doesn't actually address the question in the way we wanted them to, then that's their privilege. Interviewer. So somebody wants to ask a question. Jürgen Mohan wants to ask a question. So I think we respect silences. I think I have never pushed interviewees into speaking if I feel there's resistance. I don't want to push them further, but I know that some other oral historians would feel differently about that. But so you talked about, what did you say, silences, and I'll just look at your questions to see if that's what you said. Mostly about, what is it you said? Something about silences, then what did you say? Something else in your question?
I said that we often celebrate rich narratives, but how should historians work with gaps, silences, or conflicting accounts, especially when they challenge the established frameworks of history?
Well, I think that's the richness of oral history. If it does challenge, maybe it challenges us ourselves. Maybe I might hear things I didn't want to hear because it challenges my understanding of the past. So I think what comes and work with it, and yeah, I think it's we can't control. We shouldn't be seeking to control what people say. You know, we take a risk when we start talking to people that they might take us into areas that we hadn't expected. They might take us into areas of their private lives that we didn't expect to talk about, or they might, you know, go off in some direction that we hadn't expected. But I've never been one for saying that, you know, you should stop people talking about something, because you never know how relevant it's going to be. The way people choose to answer a question may not be the way that question initially understood when it was framed. So if the interviewee takes charge, in a sense, by either not speaking or going into some area then that wasn't predicted, then I think that's quite that in itself is part of the process and has to be you know, not controlled, not too much control if you can afford it. But then, well, this implies research money that enables people to talk at length. Somebody
Okay.
ask.
Yeah, ma'am. Uh, I think Yogender sir has a question. So yeah, thank you, sir.
I can't
You are
hear.
mute. You are mute. Yeah, you are
Hello,
mute.
good evening, Professor. Namaste. Hope you're doing well.
Yeah.
Ma'am, it was really nice to listen to your lecture, and it was really insightful. And ma'am, fortunately, my work area also includes oral history very much. And right now, for the past 2 days, we conducted a workshop with Wikimedia in Punjab University in Chandigarh itself, in northwestern India. And
Yeah.
we are trying to create an open knowledge initiative for Himalayas, because there is a very paucity of resources in Himalayas, and the oral narratives hold a very important place in Himalayas. And ma'am,
Yeah.
for that matter, and I'm also going to pursue the PhD from the history department itself in the same university. And ma'am, my research area focuses on the northwestern Himalayas, mainly the regions of Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Ladakh, and the Trans-Himalayan regions. And then the cultures and localities of such regions are such that the written sources are very less, and if they are destroyed, or they're in very different scripts. And me myself, I have learned 3 scripts, but it's of no use until you go into the lives of people, and ask the oral narratives, the myths, the legend, and the stories they live by. And I wanted to ask you, there are many researchers like me in the northwestern region, and the people who are interested in. And ma'am, such the oral histories that the in such places are so entangled with myths, legends, histories. And ma'am, it gets very difficult to navigate in such physical space, because getting the oral narrative for a colonial time periods, it's relatively easy. I'm not saying it's very easy, because you have to deal by several difficulties in that too. But in the space I'm navigating in, it is kind of a link between past and present. The ancient, or the stories of the ancient Himalayas, which are impacting the modern time period nowadays, because the region I live in is very culturally sensitive area. So I want to ask, how should I navigate in such space, and researchers like me, how should we get into the oral history of such places, where there are the legend, myths, and the narratives are so entangled, and also the colonial past. It also has a very rich oral history of its own, which has its impact on our ancient oral histories. How would you navigate in such a space? Because it gets very difficult for us to navigate in such a space.
Oh gosh, I think that's a challenge that certainly, I think most of us here in the West have so far not had to, you know, deal with. Our lives are somehow, in some senses, they sort of political, cultural, linguistic, symbolic differences are not quite, perhaps, so we're not so richly presented as you're describing. So I would find it really difficult to give you a clear steer through. But I wonder, I mean, I wondered what your purpose is. Is your purpose have you got a particular research question, or one particular question
Okay.
you're looking at?
Yeah. So I can narrow down. Yes, ma'am. So in my personal research, there are many deities in Western Himalayan region, which are across religion. For example, they have their relations with Buddhism. They have relations with Hinduism, and they are also kind of getting associated with the major cults in India nowadays, and they are very distinct in that sense. When we say Hinduism, quote unquote Hinduism, they are very distinct in character to that, and so that, ma'am, it gets very difficult to understand how. From where do they get their myths, their legends, and the oral histories? Because nowadays, what they are doing, they are trying to get their mythological backing from the major cults, but they're forgetting the regional narratives and the oralities, and they are getting mixed up, and it's very very difficult for the researchers to kind of understand what is the true nature of the deity or the identity of the culture that we are living in. So this is my major question that I'm going to research in this area.
So are you able? I mean, are you able to use different approaches to the interview? For example, could you have a group interview where you might have more, two or three people more talking together, and would you be able to understand their different perspectives if they were talking to each other? I mean, another possibility is using objects and asking people to bring some object which is important to them, and then getting them to talk about the object in, I don't know, this probably sounds terribly trivial and not very deep in a way, but you want to get people to be talking in a free and sort of not editing themselves in a I don't know how would they talk in a more expressive way about the meaning of these deities to them, maybe, rather than feeling that they've got to present a story for a public, that you want to hear their feelings about it, or how different situations this deity's been important to them. I don't know if that's helpful to you at all, but it's thinking about opening up discussions, opening up different ways of communicating their feelings about. Would that help, or would that make things too more complicated for you?
The things you're saying are very helpful in a way that we need for the open knowledge initiative that we are pursuing. The knowledge that comes from people is very much important for us. So the things you are saying is very true in that sense for the geographical space that I'm working in. But ma'am, I wanted to know for example, the people have a tendency to link themselves with a major cult or something big. For example, the small leaders, for example, there must be a small Democrat leader in America. He must have a tendency to link himself with Obama or a bigger leader. Similarly, if we take that example in my region, the small deities, there's a hierarchy of deity. The small deity would have a tendency, or the people for that matter would have a tendency to link themselves with a major deity of the pan-Hinduic cult of India. So and in that negotiations, they are forgetting their own oralities, their own histories, their own oral histories, the myths, the legends, and the stories that they live by. So that's my question, ma'am. How should I get people to acknowledge that and to hold that importance for them?
Can you get them to talk about particular problems that they faced where the deities have helped them, or get problems in everyday life, or get them to perhaps share a particular story, or do you interview people on their own, or do you interview people together? How do you do it?
And people are very shy, so I tend to interview them on my own. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
You might be able to present. Could you present a story that somebody tells about how the deities help them? Could you present that story to another person and get them to reflect on it? I don't know whether there's a way of linking the stories in some way across the hierarchy that you're describing. But it's difficult. I'm so ignorant of what you're talking about. I'm so ignorant of the whole context that I feel hesitant to offer any help, really.
If I could ask one last question, ma'am, it was really helpful. What you said it was really helpful. It was not that it was not helpful. It was really helpful. But the suggestions you gave me, ma'am, one suggestion would be one question that I would like to ask is that how should I deal with people? People are very emotionally connected to a place. So how should I deal with that very intense emotions that people face when I ask them sometimes a deep question that challenges their ideas and identities? So
Do they, I mean, when you're interviewing people, what is their understanding of why you're interviewing them? Is it for your purpose, or do they feel they'll get something from it themselves? Is the community gain?
Because I come from their community, they sense of have that belief in me that he's doing something, let's help him. They have that in mind. They don't have any academic training or anything. They're just normal people that I go to them and they ask some questions. They are local villagers.
Would they be interested, for example, to see their words represented in some way, like pictorially or in a photograph? So you could make something which is accessible to that community, other members of that community, so that their words become part of something which is more of a physical representation, which goes beyond just their individual contribution. And I suppose I'm thinking of, it might be in a Western context, you think you would make an exhibition for them to look at. They might be photographs to go with what they've been talking about. But would that be too challenging within that community? Maybe it's too private.
Yeah, it would be too private, ma'am, and it would be like punching them down. It would be very difficult to do that. But yeah.
So does it help them to enhance that? Would they give them pride in their community?
Yes, ma'am. There is a there is a spectrum, and some people are on a middle scale. They find their culture very nice, and they are agreeing to reform their culture, and they see that the changes that are going on, and they are accepting that there are some changes that shouldn't have been made, or that should be made. But there are some people who are not really caring about anything, and there are some people who are very chauvinistic about their culture. So that's the spectrum I'm working with.
And could you involve the schools in any way? Could children become involved?
Yeah, that's a great idea, ma'am. I haven't thought about that. Yeah.
So that
because young people are getting aware about that thing, that there are some things in our own. This is a very nice idea, ma'am. See, I got something. I'm writing it down.
Well, yes, involves children in schools at different ages in different ways. They might do some of the interviewing. The children might get involved in asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
Would they?
They
different
can.
ways.
Because children, yes, ma'am, that could be a possibility.
In our journal, Oral History, which I don't know whether you ever see, we always have a section about learning and how to involve children in oral history and how to make it part of the learning so that the teachers are accepting of it as well. So, and that helps the community sometimes to strengthen the standing of people's contributions, to make them respect the older people in their different ways. And I'm not assuming they don't respect them, but it adds respect, another dimension to respect.
Ma'am, this idea was really good, ma'am. Involving children in oral history, ma'am, it was really something I didn't thought for a long time.
I'm happy.
Finally, you gave me something. You were very skeptical that you didn't give me the answer, but you definitely gave me the point.
My reward. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. So we proceed to our next question, ma'am.
Yeah.
With the rise of digital archives and online storytelling, I sometimes worry that oral histories might get flattened into searchable, consumable data, stripped of the nuance and embodied presence that makes them so powerful. Do you see that as a real danger?
Well, yeah, the simple is yes. And the main issue is then how to prevent that happening. And I suppose, saying we're all oral historians now isn't maybe enables people to appreciate that, but it also does make people feel there's something here that they can use and use in different ways. But I saw that question because you sent it to me. It has good and bad sides to it. If people want to, one of the problems which oral history has, and this is something which has been discussed, was increasingly discussed, is that we do interviews, we archive them, they go into archives, and then people don't read them, they don't know about them. So if they become more accessible, that's a positive thing. We just have to risk what people do with them, but we have to challenge that at the same time. I don't know what to add to that.
Okay. How do you think oral history can retain its critical edge and scholarly relevance without being absorbed into the very success story that risks depoliticizing the work of memory?
Well, I just think that's the job of oral historians to do that, to prevent that happening. It's our job to retain that critical edge. It's our job to make sure it's debated and discussed, that there's a literature. So when people submit articles to our journal, Oral History, we always want them to be aware of what other oral historians have written before. They're part of a tradition. Oral history as an academic endeavour has been going for let's see now, over 50 years. So there's quite a literature, and it continues. So people need to be aware of that. They need to read their own the history of oral history and what other oral historians have researched in the past, and add to it. It's just that's what academics do, isn't it? So we're no different. That's my view, anyway.
Okay. I was also thinking about the way memories change over time. If a narrator revisits their past and tells it differently from before, how should historians approach that shifting narrative?
Well, I don't know what to say. I mean, as we age, we remember more and we remember less, and we're prompted by different things. We encounter different challenges in life stages. So sometimes, if you interview someone in a longitudinal way, as some people have been able to, then stories do change and emphases change. I think we just have to accept that we're people. This is what people do. They will. We're more reliant on that kind of shifting perception than maybe other historians are, because we're dealing with the living objects, basically, and we're dealing with memory, and we know that can be malleable, and people change their memories. I think what's quite interesting is the way in which people incorporate national stories into their personal stories, so that, and oral historians certainly in the UK have written about how national stories, like what happened to people in the Second World War, people absorb the kind of dominant view of how people felt about participating, and that can sometimes come up in interviews, and then maybe that changes over time, and people reflect and begin to have a different understanding of what that past was, and then their part in it. I mean, that's an interesting thing. If people do make those changes and one's able to take note of them, then that's part of the process, I think, of being an oral historian, and understanding that kind of those collective memories that people have written about. Anna Green, as an oral historian who's written about the importance of understanding the collective memories and how individuals respond to collective memory, and Al Thompson again talking about collective memory in response to conflict. This is all part of this is part of how oral historians work, and have to understand how the world works and how individuals respond to things. People, I think, may well change their stories as some stories become more acceptable to be told. For example, the stories about how people came to the UK to live and work, and were encouraged to come to work in the UK. That story has undergone some pretty big changes in the last few years, because it's now now evident, particularly people who came from the Caribbean, that invitation was not of quite an honest invitation, and that people have found themselves to be they're now, although they're invited and included and told their work was important, some of them found now that they're not citizens of this country. So the way they tell that story will have changed over the decades, as it's now become public knowledge and a source of great public anger on some people's parts, that people could be betrayed like that. So I think these are important and interesting shifts to acknowledge. I hope that answers your question.
Some critics argue that oral history is anecdotal, fragmented, even too subjective to be taken as rigorous historical evidence. How would you respond to that kind of critique?
Well, I think we touched on that already, really, haven't we? That oral history has, from the start, been criticised, because it's not based on what are regarded as the really solid data, which is documentary sources, and B, because quite often oral historians prefer to talk to people who don't have a kind of professional or some kind of elevated status in society. So it's always treated as something which might not be important. And quite often oral historians are interested in things which traditional historians would never have regarded as part of history. For example, we have just published an article in our current issue of our journal. I'll show you the front of the picture. This is our current issue of our journal. It's about cooking and food in Indian households. Now, that's very interesting, and it throws up all sorts of issues, but how many traditional historians would have thought it was at all significant to talk about food and cooking in a household? Why should one be listening to people who have a lowly status? A, they're women, and B, they might not be high in society. What does it tell us about society? And I think it's those sort of things which, traditionally oral historians have had to resist. They've had to resist because they're actually talking to people who are low status quite often, and about aspects of life which are not regarded as significant. They're not about power, and they're not about politics at an international or national level. So I just regard it as a kind of abuse that people say, this is all anecdotal stuff, because everything's anecdotal in the end. The memoirs of Winston Churchill are anecdotal at that level. So who decides what's anecdotal and what's not?
Yes, Joginder, you can ask me.
Ma'am, I'm back again. I got some time to think. Yeah, ma'am. So the area I'm researching in, the lines between myths and the histories get really blurred sometimes. And I've thought that I don't want to segregate or create a dichotomy between myths and histories for the time being. The main reason being because the both myths and the legends and oral and the histories that are factual create an impact on people, and they are the histories of people. They are what people believe in. So it is important for me what people believe in and for my research. So how do I navigate in such space wherein I don't want to kind of create a dichotomy? This is myth and this is oral. This is something factual, but still getting something concrete from that. Because it's getting really, sometimes it's get difficult to kind of my mind gets distracted and gets into the thinking that I should create a dichotomy, but then I have to reel in myself and to stop myself in creating that dichotomy. To how should I stop that? Yeah, that's the main question, I think. Yeah.
Oh gosh, another difficult one for me to answer. I mean, the myths are important to people. They tell those myths because they help them in some situation, or they help them to explain the world. Can you look at the myths in the context of what particular problem they are addressing, or what particular kind of event? And can you? I mean, you're talking about the myths as if you know what is a myth. So how do you decide what's a myth and what's not a myth? Then those are the sort of criteria you might want to bring into. I mean, I don't know if they're myths about events or about people individually or about medical conditions, or they're about
It is more cultural in nature. For example, the origin of the tribe, origin of the people, origin of the deity, origin of a particular ritual. So that kind of thing. I'm more into cultural side of the historical tangent.
so does it matter that you call it that you regard it as a myth? It's just part of that culture, isn't it? Why do you have to distinguish it as mythical? It's just simply cultural, isn't it? It's just part of those people, how they express themselves or how they explain themselves. Is it it's obviously important to you to identify that difference, but maybe it isn't important to them, but that's then the nature of their lives, isn't it?
And the idea is I come from the same community, and my research gets really influenced by my subjectivity too, and my thinking and the things I've read, and it's really difficult to navigate between objectivity and subjectivity in that sense. So that's also a problem in me.
Maybe that's part of that is part of the study, in a sense. Then that is material to your, or it's significant in your investigation, that you yourself are in that compromised position because you've grown up and you're part of that community. So that would be interesting to write about. Surely that you feel as an investigator in that context, you're not without. You sympathise, you empathise, you're part of that cultural life. So that's. I mean, I can't. I don't know enough about anything that you're talking about to sound convincing, I'm sure. But people, in the UK who've done studies of community often have tried to draw a line between themselves and that community. Often that's because they are people who've gone into that community. They're outsiders who try to become part of that community. But you're in a unique position in some ways, that you're already in that community. Yeah. So that's quite an interesting issue to reflect on, surely. Mm-hmm. Is it? Maybe it's too. Maybe you don't want to. I don't know how easy it is to do.
Yeah, ma'am. Sometimes I have to hold myself back.
Well, yeah. I mean, hold yourself back from what? Sounding critical or sounding
standing critical. First of all, I have to get aware that if I'm getting too critical, if I'm just thinking from just an academical sense and not thinking from the lens of people, because I'm also part of the community. Or the third thought is that should I get away from the community and make my research more hermeneutical in that sense? For example, an external research. Should I? But it's not possible for me to get away from the community at that sense. Yeah.
I think I can't think of what to say now at this moment because I can't summon it up. But I'm sure there are people who've written about this from within other contexts, maybe. I'm trying to think of more anthropological approaches to oral history. So it might be interesting to think along those lines, particularly perhaps, I don't know who I'm trying to think about, maybe in Latin America or somewhere. People are, wanting to somehow be a voice for that community, but at the same time, knowing they're part of it. That's a very hard, it's not a line you necessarily want to draw, but on the other hand, being able to stand almost as an outsider for a while and consider that's kind of I don't want to say an advantage, but it gives a kind of strength to what you can offer, doesn't it? Or maybe you want to be on both.
Yeah, it gives me a position that I have access to that community, to that very close community, and that's really important for me, and it's really important for my research. It's kind of basis of my research because I have that access to that community. So that is something positive. But in more academical sense, it's creating many hurdles because I have to deal with many things and with my own subjectivity on that topics and ideas, because I've lived by that culture and have views on that culture since childhood.
I think you could do something really interesting writing about your own subjectivity there. I think that would be really interesting to do if you can. I think that might be helpful to other people, that dilemma that you're presenting. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, it would be great if I could get your email ID. It would be really nice to talk to you on.
People that you could talk to. Yeah, all right. Yeah, you do. That's fine. And I'm sure you'll send my email if you're going to ask for it. You'll you'll send him the email. Yes. I'm happy for you to write to me anyway.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. I'll get it from the community, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. That's fine.
Thank you, Pete.
Okay, so the next question. In much of the literature, oral history's success is tied to Western contexts. Do you think the same methods translate effectively when working with subaltern or marginalized communities in the global South?
I'm just looking for that question so I can see it again. I could say, oh, it's fine, and then we're just listening to Uganda and he's saying it's not, maybe it's not so fine, it's not so easy. I think it depends on the context there. I mean, if you're talking about and the purpose of what you're doing. And I think it's important for people in the global South and the global majorities to actually make oral history work for them. If it doesn't work, then change it in some ways, or if there's an approach that works better in some context, then use that. So I think it's got to be a critical reflective process. And you might want to use the term subaltern, but I marginalized and subaltern, I obviously recognize there are those communities and there are those societies, but I don't see how it cannot not work. Every society has an oral tradition. People are used to orality. So develop it as you would wish. If it's, as a means to understanding how that society has evolved and emerged and what's important to people in that society, and keeping that critical edge. And if it gets into a critical perspective, then so much the better. I think it's fulfilling oral history's purpose if it keeps that critical edge going. So I say, I don't see there's a problem, but that's not for me to say, because I'm not part of what you describe. But I would hope that people would see there's something in it for them, and they have done. I mean, there are lots of good examples where people have used oral history in a variety of kind of contexts, in a variety of kinds of society, with histories of oppression, histories of marginalization. But people see it as a means to actually liberating them, their own histories, and I would hope they would see it that way always.
And one last thought. Who actually decides which oral histories got preserved and which are left out? Can the very act of archiving risk reproducing the same hierarchies oral history set out to challenge?
Well, that is a problem. That's a good question, because we can have all these intentions and we have all these, political commitments to oral history as an agent of change, but we're all part of that's those structures in society. And who gets funded to do oral history, that often determines how well preserved and how accessible those interviews are at the end of it all. And we have to be aware of those differences and those inequalities, and understand. It's certainly true that some stories get preserved and some don't, and so that critical edge that oral history has to be preserved right through the process. It's not just in the interview. Well, it's before you start, in setting the questions, in devising your your problem, and carrying it through. That critical edge has to be maintained right through to depositing in the archives, and then deciding and determining how people get access and continue to have access. So that's really important. But as everywhere, people are limited by what money is made available for people to do. Oral history is not a cheap activity. If you're going to do it properly, it requires funding for people to have the time to do it, to have the training, the time, the support, and the transcription and the preparation for archiving, and then to make sure that it gets known about. So it's like any other kind of research; it has its own budgetary constraints. But yeah, we have to be alive and to the kind of threats that you indicate there in your question. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, ma'am. And Yoginder, do you have any comments or anything, any questions?
No, no more questions. I got a really nice point about children, role of children in oral history, and that's really something I would really explore in that matter, because children have that access and they have the solution uh, that they can write down the experiences. Even if a short article, for example, if we give 100 students a task in a school, a kind of activity to fun activity to do, or to get involved them with us, it would be really nice to get them socialized in the academic field, or to see if there is something concrete that they can work on and get them. Yeah, it would be really great, ma'am.
And I think the other aspect of what you're saying, and you're indicating it, is there's so many dimensions to that. There's literacy, there's orality, there's writing, all sorts of parts of the learning process which oral history can support in different ways. So yeah, I'm glad that's something. But I'd like to thank you all for hosting this conversation, and thank you very much for asking the questions, and such interesting questions. And it's late for you now, so good that you've entertained me all this time, and thank you very much. I feel very grateful to you.
So, thank you, Professor Bornat, for your deeply engaging and thought-provoking lecture. Your reflections on "We are all oral historians now" have reminded us that history is not confined to archives or texts, but lives in voices, memories, and the fragile yet powerful act of storytelling. You have shown us that oral history is not simply about collecting testimonies, but about listening with care and responsibility, honoring dignity, affirming memory, and revealing the connections between personal lives and wider social currents. Your words have also reminded us that in an age of rapid change and uncertainty, the practice of listening and remembering becomes even more urgent. Oral history, as you have shown, is not just a method for scholars, but a responsibility for all of us to carry forward stories, safeguard voices, and ensure that the experiences of individuals and communities continue to shape how we understand both our past and our present. On behalf of Voices from the Periphery, we offer our deepest gratitude for the insight and inspiration you have shared with us. Your presence tonight has been a profound reminder that history is a living dialogue, spoken, heard, and shared. And we are truly honored, ma'am.
Well, thank you again. Thank you very much for hosting me. It's really interested hearing from you and been taking part in this dialogue. It's been a great privilege. Thank you very much. Okay.
Namaste, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.